Hello everyone and welcome to Hamer Reviews. My name is Christopher Hamer and this is my full review of the Nikon Z9 after I posted my initial impressions video that I recorded at the Z9 Experience Day back in March. Now I've had about 2 weeks with the Z9. I've used it the first week on the version 1.0 firmware and then actually extended my hire of the camera a little bit in order to test it properly on the version 2.0 firmware because there were loads of updates. I do, however, want to start off with a tiny little bit of history, if you'll indulge me. So my Z journey started with the Z6, which I have here. I was really impressed with the Z6, and it was what allowed me to record my first videos with a bit more confidence about autofocus and so on, and not needing to worry versus using a DSLR. And it was a really good experience. I really enjoyed the camera. When the Z6 II was announced, I bought that, which is what I'm currently recording on. And along the way, I picked up the Nikon ZFC and the Nikon Z50 as well. And I've been quite impressed at their progression through those cameras, but I was always left a little bit wanting with regards to autofocus. Now, if I move these to the side, the Z9 answers pretty much all of those hopes that I had for the Z series in terms of really getting on top of autofocus, but also just delivering a complete package in terms of the hybrid camera that the cameras that the Z series has become and what the Z9 is. Now the 2.0 firmware is a big thing and there's been loads of videos about it, but I think that the main change there was autofocus choice. And obviously video. Video was the big headliner, right? We've added NRAW, 8K, well 8.3K actually, RAW recording directly to the camera. They've added ProRes RAW as well, 12-bit if you want to shoot in 4K. So we've got a lot more choice, which is great. But at its heart, this is still the same £5,300, 45 megapixel camera that it was when it launched, just they've added so much more through software. And I think that is the story of the Z series. On the Z6, we're now on like version 3 point something firmware. They've added a whole load of features as they've gone. Indeed, they've made it very comparable to the Z6 II. The Z6 II is now on version 1.4 firmware. Nikon has continuously developed features and added them in. Now, with regards to the Z9, I do think that 2.0 firmware is probably what it was supposed to launch with, but for one reason or another, they got delayed and they've added them in. But they've added them in much quicker than I think a lot of people expected. So good job, Nikon. It's great to see the Z9 having received such a big update so soon in its life. The Z9 itself, let's have a chat about it. So it's a pro style body. There's no question about it. If the price wasn't the main indicator, then definitely the size of it should really, tell you that. You've got the built-in portrait grip, so this is super easy to use if you're shooting portrait stills. You've got a really comfortable ergonomic body, whether it's all the rounded corners, the buttons that are perfectly placed, whether it's the 3 function buttons on the front, the clever autofocus selector on the side. All of these can be changed in terms of what they actually do. You've got more ports than you can shake a stick at. USB-C with power delivery, we'll get onto that. The HDMI, which is full size. Microphone in that's powered. If you need to power a higher powered microphone, that's great. Obviously headphone slot and also a full LAN port as well. And that's not counting the stuff that's hidden behind the scenes. Built-in GPS, which is a really nice addition for Nikon. You've also got Wi-Fi and Bluetooth too. So this is very well set out, very ergonomic and very easy to use, even if you're new to Nikon's systems. I love all the controls. The back of the camera is simply fabulous, to be honest with you. You have every button that you could possibly want. Quick access to quality and white balance, 2 info buttons. I mean, they've really laid it out so that if you're using the portrait grip, you can even get to the playback button really easily, something which wasn't the case in the past. This has been well thought out. The top of the camera is the first Nikon Z series camera to do away with the PSAM dial and actually have the full Pro layout. So rather than the mode dial, you actually have a mode button, which allows you to change it with one of the dials on the back. And then instead of the rest of those, you have flash settings, bracketing settings, shutter modes. So you also have the shutter selection wheel here. This is very much the Pro camera. This is essentially the D6 turned into a mirrorless camera and then some. In terms of still performance, it impresses across the board. 20 frames per second, raw shooting, which is great. You will fill the buffer very quickly, even with a very high quality memory card, and you will need those. But yeah, it's not bad in terms of its raw shooting capability. If you're willing to drop down to JPEG, you can shoot 30 frames per second at full resolution. Or if you're willing to go down to 11 megapixels on JPEG, it will shoot 120 frames per second, which is fantastic. One of the features that was actually added through the 2.0 firmware is basically pre-roll shooting. So imagine this, if you turn it on in the settings, you have it in either the 30 frames per second or 120 frames per second modes. The camera is already shooting photographs before you press the shutter button, basically as soon as you half press it, as soon as you're focusing. And the idea is if something happens whilst you're focusing, but you were holding down the shutter button without pressing it, you can actually, when you press it, save the previous up to 1 second's worth of images, up to 120 frames if you're in the 120 mode. I initially thought this was a gimmick except for like sports and, sports photographers and like event photographers, but I was wrong. I went out shooting some birds and there were some that sort of fishing in the water, well, ducks essentially, and I was really surprised by how many times I was actually able to capture things I wasn't otherwise able to capture, because as soon as they start moving, it takes your reaction time, and then you press the shutter button and the fun moment's kind of gone. But with this, because I was getting the second beforehand, actually it made up for my reaction time. So that's really cool. You can choose like 0.3, 0.5, 0.7 or 1 second. So it's a really cool feature and actually quite like it, really fun. The story with ISO is an interesting one because I think that might be one of the areas where the Z9 is slightly weaker. The images definitely look pretty bad sometimes when reviewing them in Lightroom. Slightly better when looking at Nikon's own capture software, which clearly is a little bit better optimized, and hopefully Adobe sorts their stuff out. But the camera does produce decent high ISO images, but when you really start pushing it, it does quickly get quite grainy and make the images slightly harder to use straight out of the camera. I've heard some people complain that, ISO 1600 and above are pretty grainy for them and not really usable. I'm not sure I agree with that, but the higher ISO images definitely take a bit more work to make them look good. And yeah, I can get a passable images at ISO 10,000, but that's if I'm printing them at say A4, 8x10 or whatever it is. But it's definitely where the camera's weakest. It's also, it's not quite as polished as say the images I can get out of the Z6 II, which is a little bit frustrating. It is a much higher megapixel sensor. But yeah, that's something to keep in mind. The sort of ISO capability of the camera isn't quite as good as what you might initially think. But that's not to say you can't get usable images. If you're being nitpicky, it's the area where the camera is probably weakest. But perhaps that's something we'll see Nikon focus future software updates on. Autofocus is, of course, a bit of a thing that Nikon needed to deal with, because the Z6 II I think is great, and even the Z6 is very usable, but there was a lot of criticism from a lot of people about Nikon's autofocus capabilities. To me, the Z9 is very, very impressive. The best mirrorless camera I'd used before this, in terms of autofocus, was the Canon EOS R5, which I was really impressed by and had no qualms admitting that it was better than any of the Nikon offerings that I'd tried. This, however, does surpass that, which is really good. Now, I haven't tried the Canon R3 or indeed the Sony A1, but to me, this is definitely better than the R5 and way, way better than the Z6, Z7 II, Z6 II, etc. I like the fact that we've got 3D tracking back, which is something that was kind of lacking on Nikon's other cameras. I love the fact you just decide to lock it on an object, whether it's a car, a person, a tree, a ball, an animal. It doesn't matter what it is, the camera locks onto it. If you lose it out the frame, yes, you need to relock it, otherwise it won't necessarily grab it back again. But you know what? The 3D tracking is back and it's great. The auto AF modes work very well. This is true across stills and video. If you want to track subjects, you can choose from animals, people, cars, though you can also let the camera decide for you, which is quite nice. In terms of actual focus boxes, where it focuses or pulls the focus from, you get some customizability now as well, which was added in the firmware update. So you can actually create custom shapes. Up to 2 of them can be saved. That you could create infinite amounts and just save them as you need them. And it's really cool because you can choose like even a thin line if you're, for instance, videoing a panel discussion, or you can choose like a larger box to feel exactly where some action is happening and leave out the edges. It's very clever. I like that. I hope that's something actually that trickles down to the Z6, Z6 II, Z7, Z7 II, etc. Because I can't imagine that's a feature that's terribly difficult to implement on those cameras, and it would be nice to see. It'd be nice to have that option. Autofocus in low light is one of those things that does suffer a bit. Now, I think this is true across the mirrorless board, though I may be wrong. As I said, I don't have experience of every mirrorless camera. But when I was underexposing my image, the camera just really found it difficult to focus, lost focus a lot. If I correctly exposed the image, even in the dark, it was all right. But as I say, if you're underexposing, then autofocus is pretty hopeless, which is kind of a shame. But I don't know if I'm just expecting too much. It's definitely felt worse than DSLR would have back in the day, or at least it was to my impression. But then again, there aren't that many situations where you're purposely trying to shoot a scene that dark. I mean, I'm really talking like underexposed, like 3 stops plus. Generally, though, autofocus does deliver. It even delivers in quite difficult scenes. I was shooting some birds against trees. I think notoriously difficult to photograph. It did pretty well, I'd say. 90% of the time it was pretty accurate. Shooting other subjects, shooting people, like 95% of the time I found the photos really good. Occasionally it will miss the eye and you'll focus on a different part of the face, but it's just leaps and bounds better than any of the other Nikons that I've tried. So it's nice to see that we've finally seen Nikon catch up with the competition and really develop their technologies past that too. The other big thing about the Z9 being a hybrid camera is its video capabilities, and that's really where the firmware update changed the camera entirely. We now have NRAW, which is Nikon's own RAW video file format, and it delivers up to 8.3K footage at 60 frames per second, which is somewhat mind-blowing. Recorded internally to CF Express cards. It has dual CF Express card slots. I'm not sure if I mentioned that. You'll need really high quality cards to achieve that. The Angelbird 512GB SE is kind of the minimum, I think, that you can use, because I think at NRAW it's recording 730 odd megabytes a second, so quite a lot of storage required. The camera can definitely deliver on that, and the NRAW can only currently be edited with Blackmagic's DaVinci Resolve. I downloaded it again. I don't usually have a great relationship with that piece of editing software. It can't be used in Final Cut Pro or Adobe Premiere, but hopefully they'll catch up eventually. But yeah, it is very impressive footage and surprisingly easy to edit. The other options you now have is 12-bit ProRes RAW. Now, that's limited to 4.1K 60 frames per second, or in DX crop, 5.4K at 30 frames per second. To be honest with you, I'd probably go with the 4K setting in NRAW instead, unless you need to be able to edit it. But actually, I probably would just continue shooting 10-bit ProRes personally. 12-bit ProRes RAW obviously has its advantages, being able to change white balance and so on better afterwards. But I still think the 10-bit footage that comes out of this is absolutely fantastic. And as a result, I'm kind of the opinion that you could quite happily continue to use 10-bit and get the best, unless you desperately need all the control in the world of your footage, which I know some people might. Equally, NRAW should provide that same level of editing capabilities as well, so do keep that in mind. One of my minor bugbears is that, from my testing at least, I wasn't able to output the 12-bit footage through HDMI on this camera, so I wasn't able to record it with my Atomos Ninja 5, which is what I wanted to do. I don't have the Ninja 5 Plus, so I wasn't able to check if you could output the 8K footage. Being NRAW, I'm not even sure it would see it, but that's something that might come as a software update down the line. At the moment, you can't even record, ProRes RAW, so kind of a weird omission given that the Z6 II with a software update, paid for software update, can do that. Overall, though, in terms of video, the autofocus is the same as I already discussed, but it's a really enjoyable camera to use as a video camera. The powered mic port is an interesting addition too. So being able to potentially power a larger microphone with this is quite cool. Something that you can turn on and off in the settings. But yeah, do keep that in mind. And also, there's lots of things hidden in the settings. It's very frustrating because Nikon's added loads of great features, but you need to make sure you actually unlock them first. So for instance, you can actually shoot oversampled 4K, which are, 4K 60, which is what I absolutely recommend you do, but you need to switch it on in the settings first. You can have a waveform come up on the camera display or a histogram, but you need to choose to add that to your display settings that you can run through by pressing the display button on the back of the camera. So again, there's lots of cool settings. Just make sure you actually select them and choose to use them. Now, powering this camera is a EN-EL18D 36 watt-hour battery pack. Now, battery pack is large. It's part of the reason why the camera is so big, and this camera is compatible with like the EN-EL18C as well, and potentially the earlier versions too. Now, the camera also has USB-C power delivery as well, right? Which in theory is a pretty good addition. It means you can charge the camera directly from a USB-C charger, but equally, if you plug it into a USB power bank, USB-C power delivery power bank, you can power the camera from that too. Now, depending on what you're doing, you might still deplete some of the battery, but it will reduce the battery draw significantly and give you much longer battery life. I definitely would suggest you do that if you're shooting a really long video, for instance, where you want a single shot, for instance, an event. You'll definitely want to do that. The battery does last for a very long time. I shot a couple of hours of video on the built-in battery, and that was great. And stills-wise, like literally thousands of photos, and still had about 35% left. So the battery is very, very good in this camera. But having that option for really long shoots to power it partially by USB-C is very nice. On the subject of memory cards, the two CF Express slots are behind the hardest door to open ever. You have to flick down a switch, pull it back, and then it flips open. Bit weird. I wish it wasn't quite so difficult. I mean, it's kind of like the Nikon Z6 and Z6 IIs are far too easy to open, and this is far too hard, in my opinion. You have the dual CF Express slots there. As I said, I definitely would make sure you buy high-quality cards, though you don't necessarily need to spend a fortune, because the Angelbird 512GB SE that I mentioned earlier only costs about £250, so it's quite affordable for a CF Express card. Generally speaking, I really like this camera. The ergonomics are fantastic. It feels great. It has all of the pro features you'd want. It even has, I don't think I mentioned this before, but you've got the usual multifunction port and flash sync port on here. You've got everything you could need to be able to take great photos and great video. Personally, this is kind of awkward. I love the camera. It's really nice. It does cost £5,300, which is a heck of a lot of money for me, especially with the gear I've already got, which I don't really want to sell to buy one body. But what I really want is, to me, this is like a D3, right? It's that level of step change in Nikon's ecosystem. Maybe not for the whole industry the way the D3 was, but it's certainly, in terms of Nikon's own journey, this to me is like a D3 moment. So what I want is the D700. I don't care whether that ends up being the Z6 III or the Z8 or whatever they want to call it, but I want the slightly smaller package. It doesn't need to be quite as small as the Z6, but this style body where I can add a battery pack if I want. I'd like to see the same level of autofocus and perhaps the same 4K recording capabilities as this has. That's kind of my wish for Nikon. I really can't wait to see some of this trickle down. I don't think they've completely given up on the Z6 II yet, so we might see some firmware updates there, but there's some stuff they can't suddenly add, like NRAW or internal ProRes recording. So I look forward to the next generation, because this to me is such a jump that whatever comes next is going to be just as exciting. So hopefully you found this useful. Hopefully you found the sample video and the sample pictures that you saw useful. If you have any questions about the Z9, pop them in the comment section. I'd love to know what you think and what you'd like to know about it. If you enjoyed the video, give it a thumbs up. And if you haven't already, please do subscribe, as it really helps me out. Thank you very much for watching. I do hope I see you again next time. Goodbye.